Hello, and welcome to the No Bad Questions podcast, where I try to learn in a conversational manner by sitting down with people who have interesting careers, important lessons to tell, or inspiring stories. I hope that you learn something too. If you want to support the podcast, please follow or subscribe on your platform of choice. You can also like or comment to boost the algorithms or share out to your network to make sure it gets more views. But ultimately, and what I hope you choose to do, is listen to the very end. With that, we'll start today's podcast. Hello and welcome to the Christmas special episode of the No Bad Questions podcast. Joining me today is Brian Earl. Since 2016, Brian has been telling the fascinating stories behind our favorite holidays traditions through his podcast, Christmas Past. Inspired by public radio-style storytelling, Christmas Past provides a lens through which listeners can view Christmas as festive, cheerful, strange, and above all, endlessly fascinating. Think NPR meets Clement Clarke Moore. Earlier this year in 2022, Brian authored a book based on his podcast, available in hardcover and ebook from Lions Press, as well as an audiobook from Recorded Books. Brian, thank you for joining me here on No Bad Questions.
Oh, thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
So what motivated you? You released this book. The time of this Christmas special here will have been out for a few weeks. I hope that it's doing well. But what motivated you to do all this work, to start a podcast about Christmas, to write a book? What's your drive?
Yeah, well, I guess I just have this fundamental belief that Christmas isn't only the most wonderful time of the year, it's also the most fascinating. There's really no other cultural phenomenon whereby we change almost everything about the way that the world looks and smells and tastes. We change our behaviors, some of our attitudes. We change how we act from between one another. We even change the way we talk. Like words like humbug and tis and twas come into our vocabularies for 6 weeks or so and then leave again. And there's really the idea that we do something like that we can so drastically change our environment and ourselves and then change back, I feel like is one of the things that just makes us human, and Christmas just being the most dramatic example of something like that. But then there's also the individual traditions themselves, where every single one of them has a story behind it that you've probably never heard before or haven't heard the whole story behind it. And I feel like for most people, this sounds like a very obvious thing to say, but if you celebrate Christmas, you've probably always celebrated it. You've never known a year where you didn't have it. And so a lot of the things that we do just feel really normal to you because they've always been that way. But if you stop and say like, well, wait a second, why do we put a tree in our living rooms for like 6 weeks out of the year? Why do we talk about these things that no longer exist, like wassailing or sugar plums, right? They're part of what we understand to be Christmas, even though these are things that we never see anymore. And so I think it was around 2015 where I said to myself, I would love if there were like a podcast. I wonder if NPR has a podcast that kind of does this nerdy deep dive into Christmas traditions. And so I went looking for it and it didn't exist. And at the time in 2015, there were like 6 Christmas podcasts. There was The Christmas Stocking, which I still think is one of the best, even though it's not putting out new episodes. And a couple, like a church was putting out their Christmas sermons as a podcast, and a couple of playlists of Christmas music, but really there wasn't much. And I said, I think I can't be the only one who would like something like this. I think this ought to exist. And so I'm going to give it a try. And I should say I had no business doing anything like this. I mean, I'm not an academic of any kind. I'm not a reporter or a journalist. I'm not a storyteller. Like, I didn't even own a microphone. I'm a software designer. I had no idea what I was doing, but I said, I'm going to give it a go. I'll try it for a year and see what happens. But within that first year, I never expected the response I was going to get. Like the Financial Times was writing about me. I was getting requests from like museum curators to use audio from my stuff in their displays. College professors were saying, "Oh, I played this in class as an example of good storytelling and pacing." And I said, "Well, I guess I'm on to something. Maybe I'm on to something. I'll do it for another year and another year after that." So now I'm beginning my 7th season. And a couple of seasons ago, I crossed a certain threshold in terms of my audience size and my downloads and all of that, where I said, okay, well, I think I'm ready for whatever the next thing is. What might the next thing be? And, I think a book just felt like a natural thing, not only because most of my podcast episodes are scripted, like a lot of the material was kind of really ready to be turned into book form, but also because in the same way that there are lots of Christmas podcasts now, but none of them are quite doing what I'm doing, kind of creating this platform or lens for thinking about Christmas where curiosity and fascination are front and center. There really wasn't something like that for Christmas, not in quite the same way that I was thinking about in book form, I mean. Something where, we have these little bite-sized chapters that give you, tell you an interesting story, and do it in the way where I'm relying on experts. So a big part of what makes the show what it is, because again, like I said, I'm not any kind of academic or historian, but my aim has always been to take a tradition and find a story behind it, make sure that there is an interesting story, and then find the absolute leading expert in the world I can find to help me tell that story. And so over the years, I've talked to someone who runs a professional Santa Claus school. I've talked to botanists, CEOs. I talked to the CEO of a candy cane factory. And some of the coolest things is that this is something we can get to in a second. Like one of the big themes that comes up on the show is that Christmas it's always changing. It's always in flux. Traditions are cropping up and dying out, like literally almost every year. And so what that means is we're always living through Christmas history. We're living through traditions coming into being. And so within our lifetime, those Christmas popcorn tins, the ones you always see, like that's new, right? That's within, it started a little bit before I was born. So the guy responsible for that is still alive. And I got a chance to talk to him. He's in an episode that's coming out this season. And again, there's like this whole story, like why do we see those huge popcorn tins? I'm the kind of person, I see that and I have to know. And so this podcast has become not only just a fun creative outlet, it's a way for me to celebrate Christmas throughout the year because I work on it throughout the year, but also just to find out why. Why do we do the things we do that make Christmas what it is?
That sounds like quite the fun journey. And there's a lot in there that even in some of our prior conversation leading up to today's call that I hadn't thought about. So I want to pick some of that apart, and you answered a couple of my questions actually in that, so that's great. But so like one of the things that was interesting to me in what you just talked about was if you celebrate it, you sort of always celebrate it. You may not remember a year that you haven't celebrated it, and that's, I never really thought about that. I was thinking to other holidays. Have there been other holidays that I've missed? And we're in America, and some of the big ones, obviously Thanksgiving, 4th of July, things. I've missed 4th of July. It comes and goes. You don't really do anything. Conversely, I feel like the 4th of July traditions, to your point about the popcorn, which, by the way, is always something we love at our house. But I feel like the traditions of 4th of July are more static. So that's interesting about the evolution of the ongoing evolution of Christmas. And I know that some of the questions you and I had talked about are related to that. And so that's really cool. So do you feel like, so I was going to ask about sort of what prepared you, whatever, and really it sounds like just getting the right people to talk to. After 7 years of doing this though, do you feel like you are an expert now, or is there's still so many layers to peel back, so many wrappings on the package, we'll say?
Well, I mean, I guess anyone who calls himself an expert, you kind of have to cock an eyebrow at that person. I will say I've learned an awful lot, right? I know several hundred times more about Christmas than I did 7 years ago. And the good news for me is that I have just scratched the surface, right? I will never be done because I never can be. It is an endless, when I say endlessly fascinating, I really mean it. And one of the earlier themes I was talking about is the two things that come up on the show again and again are, number one, Christmas is always, always, always evolving. And we can get into that in a second. And then, so as a result of that, the Christmas that we celebrate is a lot newer than you might think. And on the one hand, that's pretty obvious. You have to think, well, okay, half of Christmas relies on things like recorded music technology, electricity, movies, right? Like those things are really in the last century. But then you think, okay, well, then everything else must be ancient because Christmas is based on this 2,000 plus year old religious story. It's filled with all the stuff that comes from the pagans, or so I've heard on the internet. But then, like one particular example of this would be the Christmas tree, and we can dive into this in more detail in a moment. But
please do.
The Christmas tree didn't start showing up in American homes until the late 19th century. The very first Christmas tree at the White House was Franklin Pierce in like 1850. It's around the time that it started to become a very popular tradition. But it didn't become common until the late 19th or even early 20th centuries in certain parts of America. So what that means is, like, for someone my age, that's like my great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents were probably among the first Americans to even have a Christmas tree. Or another example would be Santa Claus, right? Again, like, it's based on St. Nicholas. That's the guy from the 300s, right? He's always been around. But our image of Santa Claus is based mainly on artwork done in the late 19th century, starting with Thomas Nast and sort of being finished out with Norman Rockwell and this commercial artist named Haddon Sundblom, who started doing work for Coca-Cola in the 1930s.
I would say, wasn't it Coca-Cola?
Yeah. To back up a little bit, you know, the evolution of St. Nicholas to Santa Claus, you know, previously there was St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas came and delivered gifts, but he was a religious figure. He was stern, right? He wanted to make sure that you were behaving well, and part of that gets carried over. Then there is Sinterklaas, which is a Dutch legend it's not what they call St. Nicholas. It's kind of like a character based on St. Nicholas. He has a little bit more of, like, you know, more of like a gift bringer than a religious figure. When the Dutch came over to America, it kind of kept being iterated upon, but there wasn't very much consistency around what Sinterklaas or Santa Claus looked like. And so this is another thing. These traditions you've celebrated your whole life and you never stop to think about it. In the poem, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, he rides a miniature sleigh with 8 tiny reindeer. He's a right jolly old elf, right? Like, and if you look at some of the first illustrated editions of A Visit from St. Nicholas, Houghton Mifflin put one out at the beginning of the 19th century, he's short. He has pointy ears. Right. He's not human, right? He's a little like elfin gnome-like creature. But if you think of Santa Claus nowadays, you should think he just looks like your grandfather. He's like a 6-foot adult human guy. Well, where did that come from? That came from the work that started with Thomas Nast working for Harper's and really ended with Haddon Sundblom in his work for Coca-Cola. He kind of put the finishing touches on it, and we really haven't evolved the image of Santa Claus much beyond that. But that was in the 1930s. That's not even 90 years ago, or roughly 90 years ago. So there are people alive today who are older than Santa Claus himself as you understand Santa Claus. So that's how new a lot of this stuff is. Yeah. And it's just, that's the stuff that I find fascinating. All those surprises, things that just seem like they've been around forever. Poinsettias, right? Like, how can a flower be new? But they are. The poinsettia could only have become the Christmas tradition it did had it not been for this one family, the Ecke family in California, that did a bunch of genetic engineering to get the flower to look exactly right. Like, if you look at poinsettias in the wild, they don't look like the ones that you buy at the store. They spread out. They're kind of like vine-like. So, you know, at a time, the poinsettia in Mexico, it started out as a Mexican tradition. There was a whole legend behind it. But the thing that we all recognize as the Christmas poinsettia is very, very new. Like, within one lifetime, that became what it is now.
I knew the idea of Santa Claus was new. I didn't know there was quite that new. I knew something that it, you know, sort of tied into Coca-Cola, so that's a good rundown. The tiny reindeer, I've always noticed that in that poem, and so it explains how he gets up and down the chimney a little bit better, you know, if he's small. So, Brian, one of the things that you know, it comes out in what you mentioned about all these different stories of Sinterklaas and the Christmas tree is that, you know, Christmas is obviously a Christian tradition, but it seems like it's also a multicultural tradition. And there's probably a short answer and a long answer to this, but is the modern Christmas possible without American multiculturalism?
No, but it's more than that. It's also a matter of changing economies and an explosion in print media, all of which happened roughly at the same time. We're talking the middle of the 19th century. So I think it was shortly after the Civil War where America specifically moves away from being an agriculturally based society to one that's more industrial based. I forget the statistic, but most people were farmers before the Civil War, and then most people weren't afterward. And that had dramatic changes on just the way the entire economy worked, not just the kinds of jobs people had, but the kind of transportation infrastructure that you needed, the kinds of where people were living, how much disposable income they had. And that was true in other places besides America, but America especially. And then also the print media was really on the rise globally, but especially in the UK and then here in America. I think the number of daily newspapers doubled or even tripled within a short amount of time. We were producing most of the newspapers in the world at one point. And as this relates to Christmas, what it does is provides a way to socialize a certain message in a way that reaches a lot of people in a consistent way and can do it pretty quickly. So previously, Christmas may have been a very regional celebration, if it was celebrated at all. It's another interesting thing is that up until the late 19th or even early 20th century, some banks were open on Christmas, some schools were open on Christmas. It wasn't even a national holiday until Grant proposed that it would be. And that was at the federal level. I think the last state to come into the fold was Oklahoma, and it was, I forget the year, but it was a lot more recently than you might imagine. So even the idea that Christmas is a thing that we all do is fairly new, and a big part of that is obviously commerce, but also the idea of Christmas being socialized through the media. So those two things, the changing economy that made Christmas more of a commercial holiday, and whenever people say Christmas has become more commercial, it's like, well, yeah, because we have become more commercial. If Christmas is basically just us doing stuff that we do, that as we become more commercial, then Christmas is going to become more commercial. But all of that coincided with a massive wave of immigration to America, specifically the Northeast, very specifically New York City, where within a very tight radius, you had all of these different immigrant traditions. The Dutch with their Santa Claus legend, the Germans with their Tannenbaums, the Scandinavians with their wreaths. And then interestingly, plenty of Brits too, and from other cultures as well. And part of what I like to explore is, well, okay, if all of these traditions came over, why did only some of them stick? And there's no clean answer to that, because the Victorians had the greatest cultural influence on Christmas for the longest time. And then that got switched over to us. Like Christmas, America continues to hold the greatest cultural influence over Christmas today, specifically California and New York, right? Those are the two places that are creating the most content or the most stuff that influences how we think of Christmas. But I would say that New York City is still our Christmas cultural epicenter, the Rockefeller tree, like all of the, Christmas time in the city. Sense. That's what we think of. But if most of our Christmas is based on the British tradition, why don't we enjoy the Christmas pudding? Why don't we pull Christmas crackers? I mean, we do, but not at the same level. Or what if some of the other British Christmas traditions?
Like Boxing Day. I was going to add, we don't have Boxing Day.
We don't do Boxing Day. And there's one other I was just thinking of. Mince pies, right? Like mince pies used to be popular here, and then they weren't. But they're still, that's a British Christmas. You pull your Christmas crackers, you have your pudding, you have your mince pies and things like that. Why did those fizzle out? And I think there's an answer for each tradition. There's no this is why all of these ones didn't come in. But a lot of Italians immigrated to the Northeast too. Where is the tradition of La Befana, or the things that the Feast of the Seven Fishes? Those are the kinds of things that you tend to, if you have an Italian friend, they'll tell you that that's what their grandmother does on Christmas Eve, but they haven't really become part of our Christmas yet. Right? So there's the American Christmas. It is multicultural. I like to think it's not multicultural enough, right? Because you're missing out. Big part of the satisfaction of doing the show for me has been discovering all the stuff that I've been missing out on and wondering, maybe I should try some of these things because it sounds pretty darn cool.
There's one that hasn't survived in particular that I wanted to ask you about that I heard years ago, and it's a little bit creepy, which is Krampus.
Yeah.
Why don't we have a version? And I know a number of cultures have a version of Santa's sort of bad helper for the bad kids. You know, he takes the bad kids away, or I think Krampus eats them. I mean, whatever. It's like it's worse than a lump of coal.
Yeah.
By a lot. So why don't we have a Krampus?
Well, we kind of do. And especially any communities that have, like a Scandinavian population, you'll see a bit more of the Krampus myth there. I think Krampus is kind of coming back in a way because there's a lot of renewed interest around him. There's a horror movie that came out. I think you find people who are interested in Krampus, but he's not really part of Christmas in the same way that, elves and Rudolph are.
Right.
And I think it's pretty easy to understand why Christmas in America has become this very warm, cozy, heartwarming, entirely benevolent thing about, family and generosity. And previously, a lot of these Christmas traditions you were talking about really grew out of these kind of European folk legends. A lot of these characters represent the ones you see in fairy tales where you meet up this character in the woods who'll be good to you if you tell the truth, but bad to you, or someone will play a trick on you if you're bad. Like this, it's the same kind of lineage. What happened was when the idea of Santa Claus really became popular and kind of made it back across the pond, it started to influence the way that a lot of those other Santa's helper-ish figures were portrayed in those cultures too, right? So there were, Krampus is just one of many such characters who, would threaten to kidnap children or beat them with a stick. There's Perafruitard, there's the Yulepuki, there's who's the one I always forget? Belsnickel. But those characters now have sort of become softened. They still carry a stick, but they just hold it. Those kinds of things. So I think it's really a reflection of how Christmas has changed to become a lot softer and a lot more child focused and a lot more, about giving and spending time with family, which is really new, right? Christmas, one of the big changes that Christmas has gone through over the years is that it used to be what we would describe as a public holiday. So think of holidays like Halloween, 4th of July, New Year's Eve. Those are things that communities celebrate out in the open. Versus think of something like Mother's Day or Easter, right? That's something that families celebrate in their houses together.
Okay.
Christmas used to be more like the former rather than the latter. It was mostly during the Victorians that they kind of rebranded Christmas.
Really?
They said, no, we're going to make this more of like a holiday that is the quiet, cozy, home-based holiday. And there's some reasons for that, right? I think some people will tell you, well, it's the British upper class kind of was exerting their influence. They didn't like all this drunken, partying in the streets because Christmas actually used to look a lot more like Mardi Gras. It would be, you celebrated in the pubs and then you go out through the streets making lots of noise and things like that. So there's that thread that the Victorians kind of wanted to tamp it down. But also coinciding with that is the advent of rail travel. And that changed Christmas instantly. For a number of reasons. Again, remember the infrastructure changes with the economy. So transportation changes, goods being made in one place and shipped to another.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden now people living in the city could get fresh vegetables and fruit reliably. Think of what travel would have been like in the winter before rails and obviously before cars, right? It's non-existent. But now, if you've moved away for a job or something like that and you can get home efficiently, now Christmas is a season for homecomings and family gatherings and long lost relatives. None of that, how would that have even been possible before there was a way for people to communicate or to travel? Because the other thing that happened around this time is an overhaul of the postal system in England where there was no consistent way to send postage before. It was like sometimes you would just give it to a soldier coming through town and they would get it to the next stop where it was going. You'd put it on a stagecoach and the rates were vary wildly. It was also at a time where most people didn't know how to read and write at the same level that they do now. Like literacy rates have been kind of flat. Then all of a sudden there was a postal reform called the penny post, where for a penny you could buy a postage stamp. The concept of a postage stamp came into being. That was new too. And literacy rates were on the rise. And so this is around the middle of the 19th century. So all of a sudden, now people can communicate long distances. Like that wasn't a part of normal daily life before. And then all of a sudden it was. People couldn't travel long distances before. I mean, average people at a reasonable cost. Now, all of a sudden they could. And they had more disposable income. On all of those things happening at the same time. Think of the like massive dramatic change that had on society, but then of course on Christmas. And so it brings it back to that earlier point about, well, Christmas is getting more commercial, of course, because we are. But then also think about all those other changes, you know, just like once we have new changes to ways that we can transport things or send messages, of course that's going to get reflected in Christmas.
Right.
And so if we kind of take that up to its, you know, current day, you kind of think, well, okay, well, what are the things happening today that are influencing Christmas? What changes are we living through right now if we're going to accept the idea that we're always living through some change when it comes to Christmas? And one of the first places you can look is like, well, what's new in our world now? In the last 20 years, we've dramatically changed the way that we shop around Christmas. It's still very much a commercial holiday, but I can't remember the last time I set foot in a store to do my Christmas shopping.
Yep.
Well, last year I was trying to support small businesses because of the pandemic, but
sure. Well,
but think of how much that changes Christmas culture, how much time you have on your hands and how you're going to spend that time during the holidays. There was a survey that came out, I think it was last year, a large survey, that found that 37% of Americans literally, really, truly in their hearts believe that there's some kind of a war on Christmas going on. Now, whatever your position on that is, it's still the truth that is the statistic. That is influencing Christmas. And even in the last couple of years, you hear more people calling out songs like Baby It's Cold Outside because the lyrics aren't really in step with modern values. Or even think about in the last couple of years how the pandemic really normalized telepresence as a way to connect on Christmas. I mean, Skype is 20 years old, but the idea that, you know, you're going to Skype or Zoom with your family on Christmas, I think the pandemic was really the tipping point where now that seems totally normal. Of course, you know, that doesn't seem like something that only the techie geek in your family would do. That's a normal part of connecting with family on Christmas now. So yeah, there's always these changes, and it's always going to be a matter of what's going on in the larger economy, where things are moving with like different traditions melding together. I will say it's harder there's a contradiction in term, new traditions, right? There's no such thing as a new tradition, but it's harder for traditions to emerge now because really things are being led much more from the top down by the influence of media and social media and marketing. These things aren't really growing and melding organically the way that they used to.
That makes sense. And what's fascinating about all of that is thinking about this confluence of events at the end of the last century, or I guess technically 2 centuries ago, since we're in the 21st now. But and the pace of change, I'm speaking more broadly than just Christmas now, but the pace of change that must have felt like. We feel like we're in a whirlwind today of change across society. What must that have felt like? You know, and that's a tangent for another day, perhaps with another historian, but you've given me a lot to think about on that front. So I love that and several of these other stories. What is the favorite of all the things you've researched and learned about? I mean, in your 7 years of doing this, what has been your favorite Christmas tradition, anecdote, story that you've learned about that you might want to share? Or is that a cliffhanger we need to leave for the book?
No, I mean, the book is, it's an open book. There's no secrets in it. I'm really trying to think. It's hard to pick a favorite because every single one of them is so different. And to go back to this idea that, you know, behind every Christmas tradition, there's a story, and the collection of traditions that comprise today's Christmas is just that. It's just a collection of things that have happened throughout history. It's not the complete collection at all. And it's not the final collection, right? We're going to keep removing things from Christmas and adding things to Christmas. And like I said before, the Christmas tree seems like it's been around forever, but it's only been the last like 5 generations where the Christmas tree has been central. It was something else before. Holly and ivy were the central greeneries. So what are things going to look like? I mean, again, like in not that far in the future, your great-great-grandchildren would barely recognize the way that we celebrate Christmas. Just as my 5 great-grandparents would look at what I celebrate and they would say, like, what is that? That's not Christmas. That's something else. So I think the most interesting thing for me has just been really learning how everything has changed and continues to change, and how our Christmas is really this patchwork of things that are really recent, like the songs that we recognize as the classic Christmas songs are really from the 40s, right? That's stuff like from when my mom was growing up, but I've never known a Christmas without it. Mixed in with things like, more ancient traditions like the Christmas tree, the wreaths, and things like that. And then also thanking our lucky stars that a lot of traditions that we used to have, we no longer do. Because you mentioned one of these already, the idea of these like Santa's helpers who would discipline or kidnap children. There was a Welsh tradition known as holly thrashing, which is exactly what it sounds like, where the last person to wake up on Christmas morning would be thrashed with holly until blood was drawn. I don't know if it was all of Wales or just one region of it, but if you look up holly thrashing or holming, Holming, you'll see that. There's also, hunts on Christmas morning. People go out and shoot birds. And there was even a group of people called Wren Boys, W-R-E-N, who would go around caroling, one of them carrying a dead wren on the end of a stick. And that was the way that they would go do caroling. And a lot of the traditions that we see as kind of like warm and cozy actually started out a little less so. Like caroling, previously, the other word for those were begging visits. It was these were people, again, with the changing economy and most people, even people who aren't all that wealthy, still have a standard of living like 100 times better than like the average person during feudal times. Yeah. Right. And so, like poverty was just, even in Victorian England, was just a real problem, just really, really bad. And so, these begging visits, caroling was, you'd show up at someone's door and sing a song because you wanted something in return. And some of them were a lot more like trick or treating, a lot more like, we'll sing you a song and give us something, or, hey, we don't know what's going to happen to these windows later on, that kind of thing.
Is that, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Is that, I've always thought that, we wish you a Merry Christmas was a bit demanding, bring us a figgy pudding. Is that where that comes from? Like, give me some food. Is that where that comes from? It
could be. I mean, because you're right. That song, the first verse is, we wish you a Merry Christmas. And then the remaining 5 verses are just about figgy pudding. Right. And I don't know if that's more of a song about figgy pudding or that. But, back in the day, and when you had a different economy whereby you had the landowner and everyone who lived on the land worked, and then the landowner lived in the manor. And the tradition would be every Christmas they would have a big feast, and all the subjects would come, and that would be like the one time of year where they were treated well, treated to a good meal. They could have their grievances heard by the landowner, those kinds of things. It comes from that. It comes from these Christmas visits seeking something. And it's the same thing with wassailing. Wassailing is basically this combination of caroling and trick-or-treating, but with just lots of alcohol involved. But yeah, those begging visits were a big part of Christmas. And I think we can thank goodness that they no longer are. But those things, they haven't gone away entirely. You still see those Operation Santa things that exist today, and all forms of Christmas charity. And part of what irks me is you see these every Christmas, these like, oh, look at this family needed a sofa for Christmas and the community came through. And to me, that doesn't seem heartwarming at all. That just seems sad that we still live in a world where that kind of poverty and reliance on others is still just such a part of people's lives. The fact that we're remedying that through the Christmas season, sure, not for nothing, but I don't know. Like those fall on Christmas.
Me. Why are we waiting on Christmas to help our neighbor? If we're going to help, just help,
Yeah, I feel like those things, for me, those land a little off center. That I don't quite see them as heartwarming as maybe other people do.
No, that makes sense. As we get into the end of our time, I actually am curious on merging two things that you've said here and getting your thoughts on it. Mm-hmm. You said that something in the 30 percentile range of Americans, or of those surveyed, I don't know if they were all Americans, said that they felt that Christmas was under attack. But you've also reiterated a couple times, and I think given great examples of how Christmas traditions are under constant evolution. Mm-hmm. Do you think that perhaps one of the reasons people feel like Christmas is under attack is a combination of the ongoing evolution and the permanency of recorded media? So, It's a Wonderful Life is still a very popular movie, and it's how old? These songs from the 40s are how, so we have this, it's easier to have an image of what Christmas is supposed to be. I'm doing air quotes for those who are just on audio, supposed to be. And it's given gravitas and weight by these images and these sounds that are forever. But as you said, it's constantly shifting. So do you think that juxtaposition of the permanence and the constantly shifting is contributing to that feeling of it's under attack, do you think?
I think most of what's driving the feeling is people being told that this is the way that they ought to feel. I think there's a certain wing of the media and certain personalities within it who, it's really just part of, shouting to the tribe and getting them riled up.
Okay.
And, hey, yeah. Now, at the same time, I did a whole episode on the war on Christmas with a professor named Jerry Bowler. And I came into it thinking, look, I think this is just a lot of hyperventilating. I still think that, to be honest with you. At the same time, usually those kinds of trends are spurred by stories where there's like enough truth in it to give it credence, right? I mean, it is true. There was a Supreme Court ruling that said that any public Christmas displays, like anything in a town square or whatever, can have religious figures in it, but only if it also contains secular figures. And it became colloquially known as the three reindeer rule, right? Like that you could not, on public land with public money, put up a Christmas display that was just a nativity scene or just strictly religious. And so some people see that as like, okay, well, they're watering down Christmas now, or watering down like what I being the people saying this, believe to be Christmas, that Jesus is the reason for the season. And, like they're not wrong entirely in that public displays are being kind of watered down, and watered down being a relative term, but, altered in one way. And even like in California, where I live, we have a tree lighting in my town square, and, it's lit up with Christmas tree lights. And when you go there, they're giving out candy canes and hot chocolate, but it's not a Christmas tree. It is the community winter celebration tree, right? Now, personally, I'm just like, it's a Christmas tree to me. I don't care what you want to call it in the flyer. But I get it. If you're religious, or if you've always known that as a Christmas tree and now someone's trying to call it something else, and that might feel politically motivated to some people. So I get how they're like, well, come on, why are you watering down Christmas like that? Right. But then on the same token, and I've heard of schools too, where they'll just, ban anything, you can't have a Christmas tree. So we'll call it a giving tree. Oh no, even a giving tree is too much. So we're going to have a giving table, but you can't actually give anything on the table. We'll just call it that. Like, these are real stories of things that have happened. And, like for someone like me that I grew up, we had a Christmas pageant at school, and I have a 2-year-old son. He'll be in school in a couple of years. And I would hate to think that he would not have that same experience I had growing up. I might feel very differently in a few years where I feel like something's being taken away from my son as it relates to Christmas. But then I also think that there are other things that happen that are just seen as confirming evidence of this larger trend that are they're nothing, right? Like last year, for example, there was a public Christmas tree display somewhere in New York, I want to say, that someone vandalized. And the next thing you know, all of the people, and you can guess who they are, go out in the media. Oh, this is just more evidence of the war on Christmas. People are attacking our religious symbols. There's some coordinated effort by radical socialists, blah, 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 But it just turned out it was this guy who had a record of vandalism, right? There was nothing political about it.
Yeah.
So, I think it's usually things happen where there's enough of a grain of truth in them to get people riled up. And then there are people who kind of capitalize on those feelings by keeping the anger stoked. That's my read on that.
No, and I think that's fair, and I think that's probably pervasive across our society. Unfortunately, from issue to issue, the players change, but a lot of the story stays the same, and I think that's probably quite reasonable. But I appreciate your sort of hot take on that concept because it's just something I was piecing together as we've been talking here. I know we're kind of winding down on our time, but I definitely want to wish you the best with the book and with the podcast. Where can people find you? Where can they find the book? Amazon, all those places. Like, where should they go?
Yep, you can find the book wherever you get books. And you can find the podcast wherever you get podcasts. If you want a central hub to find all of that, including my social media links, you can simply go to christmaspastpodcast.com.
All right. Brian Earl, Christmas Past Podcast, the book. My guest today here for what I'm calling the Christmas special version of No Bad Questions. Thank you very much for spending some time with me today.
Well, thank you, and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.